All right, let's talk about IFRS S2. I know, the name sounds a bit intimidating, but it's becoming absolutely essential for businesses. And really, it all boils down to one key thing, measuring your greenhouse gas emissions. So today, we're going to cut through all the jargon and give you a really practical guide on how to get it done. Let's dive in.
Here's how we'll break it down. We're going to start with the single most important rule you need to know. Then we'll unpack what those 3 emission scopes actually mean. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of Scope 2, tackle the big challenge of Scope 3, and wrap up with a clear guide on how to pick the best data. By the end, you'll have a solid roadmap.
Okay, first things first, the core requirement. Before we get lost in the details of scopes and data, you have to understand this one central idea. It's the foundation for everything else in IFRS S2 when it comes to emissions. And here it is, pulled right from the standard itself. The magic words are absolute gross emissions. What does that mean? It means the total amount, with no deductions. This isn't about your net zero plans or carbon offsets. It's about the raw, unfiltered number. This is the figure that everything else is built on.
Now, you're probably seeing that CO2 equivalent and wondering what that is. Well, think of it like a universal currency for emissions. Different gases have different impacts. Methane, for example, is way more potent than carbon dioxide. CO2e just converts all of them into a single standardized unit so we can actually compare apples to apples.
So how do you actually calculate all this stuff? Well, here's the good news. IFRS S2 doesn't make you start from scratch. It points everyone directly to the global gold standard, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. If you're going to measure your emissions, this is your playbook. Okay, so you've got your total emissions number. But you can't just report it as one big lump sum. The GHG protocol makes you break it down into 3 different categories, or scopes. And this is super useful because it gives a much clearer picture of where your emissions are really coming from. This table lays it out perfectly. Scope 1, that's the easy one. It's the emissions you create directly. Think fuel you burn in your own company vehicles or the natural gas in your on-site boilers. Scope 2 is one step removed. It's the emissions that were created to produce the energy you buy, like electricity from the grid. And then there's Scope 3. That's everything else, the whole shebang. All the emissions hidden up and down your entire value chain. Right, let's zoom in on Scope 2 for a second. Reporting the emissions from your purchased energy seems pretty straightforward, right? But IFRS S2 has some specific rules here that are really important to get right. So the standard asks for a kind of 2-part answer. First, you have to report your location-based emissions. That's calculated using the average carbon intensity of your local power grid. But if you've gone out of your way to sign a contract for renewable energy, you get to report that too. This gives a really honest picture of both the grid you're stuck with and the choices you're actively making. And now for the big one, Scope 3. Honestly, for most companies, this is the largest and by far the trickiest part of the whole thing. It covers that entire value chain we talked about. The good news is, IFRS S2 knows it's tough and gives a pretty practical framework to help you work through it. And this just shows you the sheer scale we're talking about. The standard expects you to look at all 15 categories from the GHG protocol. This means everything from your employees' business travel to the emissions from your suppliers making your parts, all the way to what happens when your customers use and eventually get rid of your products. It's a massive 360-degree view of your impact. But, and this is so important, especially for smaller businesses, here's a massive dose of reality from the standard. The guiding principle is pragmatism. You're expected to use reasonable and supportable information that's available without undue cost or effort. They're not asking for perfection. They're asking for a solid, good faith effort using the resources you actually have. So, since you'll probably be using a mix of different data sources, how do you decide what's best? Well, to make sure your reporting is as credible as possible, the standard gives you a really clear hierarchy for prioritizing your data. It's actually a very smart system. First, you need to know the difference between 2 main types of data. Primary data is the good stuff. It comes directly from activities in your value chain. Think of getting an actual fuel bill from your shipping company. Secondary data is more generic, like using a national average for what shipping emissions usually are. As you can probably guess, primary data is way better because it reflects what's really happening. This hierarchy is your decision-making tree. The absolute gold standard is direct measurement, but that's tough for Scope 3. So you immediately go for the next best thing, that primary value chain specific data. Whatever data you end up using, it needs to be up to date and relevant for the right country and technology. And hey, if you can get your hands on data that's been verified by a third party, that's a huge credibility boost.
Let's make this super simple. Say you're a small business that makes furniture. To figure out the emissions from the steel in your chair legs, you could use a generic industry average. That's secondary data. Or you could ask your steel supplier for their actual energy meter readings. That number is primary data, and according to the IFRS S2 hierarchy, that's the number you should always try to use. It's just a much more accurate picture.
So let's just do a quick recap. The main thing, you have to report your total absolute gross emissions in CO2 equivalent. The rulebook you need to use is the GHG protocol. For Scope 2, don't forget the two-part reporting for your location and any special contracts. And for the beast that is Scope 3, your guiding star is that data hierarchy. Always prioritize the best quality info you can reasonably find.
And that really brings us to the final critical question you should be asking yourself. As Scope 3 reporting becomes the norm, this isn't just about your own four walls anymore. It's about truly understanding your entire supply chain. So take a hard look at your own business. Is your data, and maybe more importantly, are your relationships with your suppliers really ready for this challenge?